So we're here today to incubate and harness 21st century solutions to long-term challenges. And we are today here with a group of very distinguished leaders, heads of state and thought leaders whose vision is unparalleled. And one day I know we will look back to this morning, to this session, and say, this was a turning point. Historically, yes, you're now at the very cutting edge of change. You are the change agents, and I know that you will inspire the change that we are looking towards. Historically, as you know, male hierarchies drafted laws and policies, and family relations, including work-family reconciliation policies, were considered outside of the ambit of lawmaking. But with more and more women at the policy-making table, at the negotiating table, we see that new laws and policies are being created in the image of both men and women. And caregiving and work-family reconciliation policies are now being placed at the very heart of law and policy reform in labor as well as in gender equality, and work-family reconciliation is becoming a major public policy issue. It is a major development issue. As you know, the 2012 flagship World Bank Development Report, in ways that was unparalleled, stated that women's disproportionate caregiving responsibilities was one of the single most important challenges, not just to women's equality in the public sphere, but had enormous development outcomes that were negative. And according to a recent analysis by the UK Equal Opportunities Commission, the lack of shared caring responsibilities between men and women was the single biggest cause of the pay gap. So we are here now to look at ways in which the gender gap in caregiving can be closed. Work-family reconciliation is also at the very heart now, not just of public policy, development, but of national security, inclusive security. Because women cannot be at the peacemaking table, at the transitional justice processes, at conflict resolution, unless women's caregiving responsibilities, the disproportionate caregiving responsibilities that women often have to shoulder, the double burden that women have to shoulder, is shared between both men and women, so that both men and women have equal rights in the public sphere and in the intimate sphere to choose and privilege caregiving. So it is thus important to create new policies that ensure that both men and women can choose and have the right to child rearing responsibilities. Just before I came here to Little Rock, Arkansas, Dr. Onyango, a former member of parliament in Kenya, who ran in the last election and lost, said, "I waited until my last born was big to run for office. I held back my career. But men don't have similar pressures. And this explains why a majority of women in politics in Kenya are either widowed, divorced, or have never married." But the South African Constitutional Court has observed that stereotypes regarding child care has denied fathers their opportunities to take part and participate in caregiving. So stereotypes in caregiving disproportionately disadvantages both men and women. And that is why it's a central public policy issue that cuts across national security and development. As Sweden told the CIDOR Committee, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, no decisive change in the distribution of functions and statuses between the sexes can be achieved if the duties of the male in society are assumed to be unaltered. And the former Swedish Prime Minister called for, in his famous speech, the emancipation of man. and argued that both men and women must bear the dual role of work-family obligations. In 2000, as you know, the Commission on the European Communities labeled the sharing of family responsibilities as the only way to achieving gender equality in the workplace. And family leave that targets men has resulted in what we now call fatherhood by gentle force, which is allowed in some ways to address the challenges of what is known in the US as the motherhood penalty, where women are disadvantaged and marginalized from the workplace, especially in high-level decision-making processes because of the dual burden of work-family responsibilities. So given this challenge, how do you, as political leaders, as thought leaders, ensure that gender-equal work-life balance policies do not subordinate women, but also advantage and provide equal rights to men to shoulder caregiving responsibilities? I now turn to His Excellency John Bruton, former Prime Minister of Ireland, who helped to transform the Irish economy. He served as the ambassador to the United States. He was Ireland's Minister of Finance, Energy and Industry. He now serves as the head of a private sector body to develop the financial service industry in Ireland. I cannot think of someone more or better positioned to speak about the importance of women in development and the way in which, given your unparalleled leadership in economic development, Your Excellency, how can you harness the evidence that women's leadership yields high dividends in terms of GDP? As I quoted before, the 2012 World Bank report now defines women's empowerment not only as the right thing to do, but as the smart thing to do. A McKinsey study has revealed that in the US, women's participation in the marketplace has resulted in a 25% increase in the US economy. Closing the gender gap further in employment in the Eurozone will increase GDP by over 13%. So, Your Excellency, what are your policy imperatives for closing the gender gap in development, using the ways in which, looking at the ways in which the disproportionate impact of caregiving has marginalized women and men who choose to give care from decision-making capacities?
Thank you very much. I think I can best speak about this from a perspective of my own country. Obviously, some of the things we were hearing yesterday about the position of women in other countries in the world are so radically bad that nothing like that occurs in a country like mine, which is a relatively developed country. First point I'd like to make is that the rapid growth in the Irish economy between the 1980s and the 1990s was in great measure due to the increased participation of women in the workforce. The proportion of women working in paid work, as distinct from unpaid caring, dramatically increased, and that accounted for a great part of the increase in the GDP. I strongly believe that we need to look at the educational system if we want to find a solution to this problem. When I was at school, I was never given the opportunity of learning cooking or learning anything to do with domestic science. And indeed, when my son went to school, he didn't have that opportunity either. And it is very hard, and it's only things that you become familiar with when you're relatively young that you can take up comfortably later. And I think that's one thing that could be done to ensure that domestic economy is something that's taught to all, boys and girls, equally. However, I think it is important to look at these issues in a wider frame. Take early school leaving. In Ireland, 12% of those who are of boys, 12% leave school without a qualification. Of girls, only 8%. Of the unemployed, the unemployment rate for men is 17.5%. The unemployment rate for women is 10.4%. Of people in prison, 7 out of 8 are boys. Of people killed in road accidents, 70% are boys or men. I think we need to ask ourselves why these things are happening. Why is the educational system not just gender stereotyping boys, but also, more importantly, I would say, failing boys? And I think one of the factors that may, and I don't know this, and there are experts here on the panel who will be able to confirm whether it's true or not, but I had a conversation about I was in Finland recently. I was talking to somebody who's very well informed about that country, and he told me that he thinks that the problem is that girls reach puberty 2 years earlier than boys do, at around 11. And that's very disruptive. The year of that transition is very disruptive to education. But nothing hangs really on what happens between 11 and 12 for many. They're not, streaming doesn't occur at that stage. Whereas for boys, it's at 13 that they reach this lost year. And that, it is argued, means that they tend to fall behind. Now, I don't know whether that's the explanation. I don't even know whether it's part of the explanation. But we need to find the explanation as to why the system is failing. Now, it is fair to say that women and men make different choices in education. 80% of those who choose engineering in Ireland are boys. 70% of those who choose healthcare professional work are girls. The health services run predominantly by women, including at management level. Is this something that represents a permanent, sort of unchanging difference between men and women? Because men and women are not exactly the same. I don't think anybody would claim that they're exactly the same. Or is it something that can be changed to the benefit of men who maybe have a caring disposition and who might, if they'd had a different education, have gravitated towards the health service, or towards education, where it's possible to have a better work-life balance because of holiday entitlements. Women are dominant in the teaching profession, which enables them to have 3 months holiday, which enables them to have a better, I don't like work-life, because work is part of life, but a better balance between paid and unpaid activity, shall we say. I think it would be a better way of phrasing this. I think we need to examine the educational system. And I just say, as far as unemployment is concerned, Ireland is a peculiar case. The difference between the male rate of unemployment and the female rate of unemployment is 7 percentage points, 17% versus 10%. There's only 2 other countries in Europe, in the European Union, where that gap is as wide as that. That's Lithuania and Bulgaria. In every other case, sorry, that was actually a figure for early school leaving. The differences are Turkey is the only European country where females substantially exceed males as early school leavers. So all across Europe, boys are leaving school early, girls are staying on. Why is that? I very much like the idea of male emancipation. I think males need to be emancipated. And I feel, I hope anyway, that the people who will emancipate them will be women.
Thank you, Excellency, for that brilliant analysis. And you're a champion for gender equality and for male emancipation. And I think given the fact that you have so very well placed the importance of education at the very heart of this debate on public policy, I want to turn to Lionel Jospin, the former Prime Minister of France and a former Minister of Education, for his insight. You spoke, Your Excellency, on Bulgaria and some of Bulgaria's own reforms, and I want to remind everyone in the audience that the Bulgarian gender equality law states in Article 38 that gender stereotypes, negative stereotypes of both women and men should be addressed through the educational system. And I think that's a very important point of the ways in which this can be addressed through public policy. Yesterday we heard from Rosa Otunbayeva, the president of Kyrgyzstan. And the Kyrgyzstan gender equality law states in Article 2, educating family members to be responsible for sharing housework and to appropriately allocate houseworks to family members should be part of a gender equality law. So I think these are very interesting ways in which education can be used as a way not just to break down gender stereotypes, but also to reimagine caregiving and those stereotypical roles that are otherwise normalized in the family. So I would like to ask Lionel Jospin, Prime Minister Lionel Jospin, for your analysis of how this can be, how the playing field can be made equal for both men and women, girls and boys, through the educational system. That doesn't work, sir. That does not work. Yes.
Well, I have three difficulties. First, I have to improvise because I was not supposed to be in the panel. Second, I have to improvise in a language I don't possess, English. And third, I have to answer your question, which for an improvisation, it's another difficulty. Well, so I improvise on thought, and I'm not sure I directly answer to your question. Well, I was a Minister of Education, but later on I was a Prime Minister, so I forgot the job of the Minister of Education. Well, when we look at the balance between work and life, it depends on the definition, I should say, because is life private life? Is life is leisure? There is an opposition between work and this life. But if we consider life as an whole, work is a part of the life. And it plays a very great role in the structuration of the life, in the status even of people. If you think to, well, the workers are their dignity in the work. If I think to my daughter, who is a painter, you could not say to her that to work is something that is restricted from her life, because it is her life, you know. So the definitions are important. If we consider work as something in opposition with private life and leisure, so we have, I think, to continue the work, the historic work, struggle of the workers to better conditions of work, to shorter duration of work. It was the struggle for the day duration, for the month, for the congé payé, I don't know. Huh? Yes. And when I was Prime Minister, I passed a law which has been discussed everywhere in the world and in Europe about the 35 hours week law. It was considered as silly, counterproductive, but in fact the reality is that during the 5 years I was in government, with this law on the 35 hours a week, we create 2 million jobs, which is the historical best performance in France for creation of jobs. And we decrease unemployment from 1 million. And the government, after, they did not dare to suppress the 35 hours a week, but they, comment on dit, détricoté, you know, they weakened it, you know. They say, okay, we will pay more supplementary hours and so on.
Yes.
Huh?
Diluted.
Merci, Monsieur Roman. And there are no jobs and no growth, you know. And during this period, the fact that the duration of work diminished was not anti-economic, because in the factories, in the enterprises, they had to discuss productivity agreement, you know, to have a better work during the narrower work of them. In the same time, we take the words, I don't know the words, le congé de maternité, you know? That. And we create a congé de paternité.
Yes.
With the same duration. So the man could choose to stay at home for 1 year if they have a baby. And so we try to contribute to a change in the culture towards the work of the two works a day for the woman.
Thank you.
I'm confident in the fact that in the younger generation, I see that with my sons. They are much involved in taking care of the babies, for instance. I have grandsons and daughters, and the fact to work in the house also for all the work in the house, you know. So I am rather confident, and if I may say so, and if we think that work is a part of the life, so we have to improve the quality of the jobs. We have to improve the training for the women. And we know, at least in France, but in other countries too, that till now, women are less paid. They are in more precarious works or jobs. So we have to act in that direction. Well, perhaps two or three improvised thinking.
Thank you, Prime Minister Jospin, for those excellent insights. And I'm so glad that you brought up the whole issue of mandatory parental leave for fathers. Because as you know, in Europe and now in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, mandatory parental leave, which makes sure that this leave is non-transferable. Because what happened historically was that parental leave that men were allowed to take would be transferred to the females, so that they would somehow abdicate their responsibilities as caregivers. So Sweden, Finland, and Norway created mandatory parental leave policies to ensure that men could not transfer these policies to their wives, so that this was a take it or lose it approach. And this created a fatherhood by gentle coercion culture, where men were then trained to cherish their caregiving and caretaking responsibilities. So when you speak about the importance of training and education, it's important to train and educate men on the values of fatherhood, of parenting. And that must go hand in hand with mandatory parental leave for fathers. And I'm so glad that you brought that up. Yesterday you spoke very eloquently, Your Excellency, on the importance of quotas. And when Spain and Norway called for 40% quotas for women on their boards, the stage had already been set for this to happen, because both Spain and Norway had also promulgated laws on mandatory parental leave that allowed men to share caregiving responsibilities. So I think your call for quotas is well taken in the context of work-family balance. And now I turn to our panelists. Nada al-Nashifi. She's the ILO regional officer for the Arab states. And we are thrilled to have her here because at this moment, this historic moment of transformation and political transition sweeping over the Arab region, it is so important to have her voice informing this discussion. Nada ILO mandates 14 weeks of leave for mothers. How many weeks of leave does ILO mandate for fathers? That's my first question. I have more for you. In the global south, countries are adjusting school time to allow children to help with the harvests. So you are creating a work-life balance, work-family reconciliation policies through the educational system. So how can more be done to adjust school time so that women can also work, and still both men and women can work and shoulder their child caring responsibilities? And thirdly, as we articulated earlier, this is a very important inclusive security issue, a foreign policy issue, a public policy issue. So do you think that in the transformation sweep in the Arab region, that women can seize this moment of change in drafting new laws to make sure that work-family reconciliation policies are made central to labor policies? Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Rangita. Actually, this is the corporate ILO presentation. The Arab States one is going to be at lunchtime. So I'm not going to get into the Arab States very much, if you'll allow. But I do want to say, because this is an area of core commitment for the International Labour Organization, and this is why, if you notice, Rangita's terminology moved from work-life balance to work-family reconciliation, and we're talking a little bit more about that, about how the underlying tensions which exist can be mitigated, since for most people, family is the largest part of life, and that's the critical part of what we have to do. Just a reminder why we're here, and certainly these all apply to the Arab world. First of all, there are global competing pressures of paid work and family obligations. More women are getting into the workforce. That's certainly true in the Arab world. There are many changes in work arrangements, flexibility, and so on. And family structure is changing, and that means more aging, more single-parent households, and these are all new dynamics that have to be incorporated. We've all heard about the unequal share of unpaid care work, obstructing women's full participation. But I'd like to talk about the economic crisis which is going on at the moment, and the rollback which is due to government austerity reforms. We heard from Prime Minister Jospin what was happening in France before, but many of the new measures are negatively impacting work-family related expenditures across, and especially in advanced economies. In Spain, for example, there has been an abolition of birth grants. This very famous parental leave benefits have been reduced, for example, in Germany. Parental leave duration reduced in Luxembourg, and then in Ireland, a lowered age of children eligible for family allowance, and in the UK, a reduction of family eligibility also in terms of number of children. So we're very concerned that when cuts have to be made, they're having to be made at these very critical balances, which took many, many, many years of achieving a consensus. Now, what do we believe can be done? This is a little bit more general. Sort of 6 sets of interventions, because we were asked to be precise, and I think that these are very effective measures, we believe, that come from our global experience, which have to be dealt with in a holistic manner. So it's not pick and choose, it's really a basket. In terms of leave policies, we've heard maternity, paternity leave, but also emergency leave, compassionate leave, and the ability to choose when leave is taken is very, very important, so that these are not enforced. Other things, long care leave, adoption leave. Again, this is all a level of maturity of society and individuals, but these are some of the tools that we have found over time can make a difference. Social security benefits, maternity, paternity, child benefits, of course, but also prenatal and childbirth, and then pension credits for caregivers. This whole notion of domestic work and where that interfaces with caregiving is a very important area of work for us. Working time and organization, again, we mentioned the length of the working week, but the whole notion of reduction in long hours and overtime. For the ILO, it's not just work, it's decent work. And so we think there should be quality part-time work, which is predictable. So when there are overtime and shifts, these should not be just reactions to exigencies of work, but really predictable. And flexi-time, which I'm sure most of you know and has proved to be, like teleworking, one of the modern responses to the need to engage more people and make better use of their time. Career breaks, time off, paid breastfeeding breaks, you know, it's a menu which can be very flexible and very effective. Care services, as we said, access to affordable and appropriate care for dependents, including the elderly, not just children, including the sick or the disabled, and the whole notion of home help and home care services, which are very, I know this has certainly in the Arab world been one of the biggest impediments to women leaving the home for other places. Of course, labor market reintegration, we're talking about all the systems that facilitate job creation, including vocational training and guidance, job searching, how you can pay for educational leave to make sure we're doing the most to get women back into the workplace. And then finally, reducing the unpaid work of women by facilitating their daily tasks. We're talking about basic infrastructure support, so how to make it more possible to get water and electricity, how to build better roads so we don't spend a disproportionate amount of time getting to places, transportation. We found in Jordan, for example, outside the main cities, the difference it makes to have a bus that will take a young woman from her home in a protected environment to a factory, a huge difference. Daycare centers and facilities at the factory level, family planning support, school canteens, and opening hours. If women can do their jobs for the family, which is perhaps get the medicines and make the doctor's appointments a little bit after hours, working hours, it makes a very big difference. And policy design matters, but I can maybe come back to that later on.
Thank you. That was a very rich menu, and you've been very concrete in your suggestions. And I'm just focusing on some of those points because, as you said, many of the laws that are emerging do privilege families' caregiving activities, including during times of adoption, during times of sickness of the child. And it includes not just parental leave, but grandparental leave for grandparents. But when I read some of these laws, especially from Eastern Europe and Central Asia, other emerging democracies, you see again there's some gender bias. It includes the right of the grandmother to give care and to be in a hospital for a period of 2 weeks at a time when a grandchild needs that care, but not a grandfather. And that discriminates against both men and women. And that brings me to the point that you raised of, given this rich menu of options that labor laws are now privileging, what we see is that women who choose to take those options, exercise those options, then sometimes face retaliation when they return to the workplace. They are not given the same level of high-level decision-making jobs because of the way in which they are perceived as being natural caregivers. And that then becomes a disadvantage. And that is why it's so important to have men join this discourse, because until you equalize caregiving and you reimagine caregiving in the image of both men and women, and men choose to exercise that option of caregiving, caregiving is still going to be discounted. It's still going to be thought of as a woman's work, as women's jobs, and therefore will not have the same validity or have the same currency in the labor market. So thank you for those reminders about the ways in which policies can embrace caregiving and make it central to labor laws. But I think now it's important to make sure that they are gender equal, and that any kind of retaliation that follows, and they may be very nuanced. It may be that women are not then allowed to travel or work late in the night. And that may be a way in which women then are disadvantaged and discriminated because they chose caregiving. Carla Koppell You were described yesterday by Swanee Hunt as the czarina of all things gender.
That's a good thing.
At
Democratic leaders, I'm not sure that's a good thing.
at the United States Agency for International Development. And I completely agree with her. But in another incarnation, you also headed the Inclusive Security Initiative that Swanee Hunt incubated. So I want you to wear both your development hats and your security hats when you're looking at this issue. As I said earlier, unfortunately, one of the reasons why women cannot be at the peacemaking table at high-level national security decision-making initiatives or at conflict resolution is because of the disproportionate share of housework and caregiving responsibilities that she often has to shoulder. And we have data that women in civil societies who want to create alternative peacemaking structures are not able to bring their children with them when they travel to the cities to engage in peacemaking and in conflict resolution. So given this, Carla, from your very, very lived experiences, what are your ideas to address work-family balance through the lenses of security? And second, since you're the only American on the panel, I want you to address the United States' rather laissez-faire attitude towards work-family reconciliation policies. It's still considered something that should be done in the context of the family, that caregiving is still a very private issue, and it's an intimate issue, and it should not be something that should be regulated. So those are the two issues that I wanted to speak to Carla.
Great. Thanks very much, Rangita. So this is a very interesting topic for me because as senior coordinator at AID, I have two roles. I both work on our projects and programs in foreign assistance and how they deal with gender issues around the world. But I also have a responsibility within the agency for how we're dealing with issues of gender equality and women's empowerment inside the US government or inside my small piece of the US government. And what I found is that there's a really interesting juxtaposition of similarities and differences that exist around the world in this field particularly. So I was in Bangladesh recently and was touring a factory, and this particular factory was part of a USAID project, and they had put in a daycare facility. And I asked what the daycare facility's impact was for the business, and they said, well, costs us very little and has had dramatic implications for staff retention and reduced absenteeism. So it's paid off in spades. And then I walked around the factory floor and I asked people, why were they working here rather than other places? And the most common response I got was, well, they had daycare facilities. And either it was a man or a woman, they would say, and my wife really wanted me to come here because they had daycare facilities so she could go work somewhere. Or the woman said, well, I like having my child nearby. So these things mattered in Bangladesh. So I come back to the United States and I talk to people and do listening sessions within USAID. And the issues are exactly the same issues. Men and women and men, talking about how to balance life and family. We recently had something called the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, which talks about how employees appreciate their workplace. And I want to tip my hat to Sean Carroll, who's here, because he was previous with AID and drove up our response rates on the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. But what we saw was the institution over the last year of telework, right? So you can work from home, and to have those changes and the creation of a staff care facility drove up the level of satisfaction in AID by 30 points. And this was across sexes, male and female. So these are issues that are very ever-present around the world. And we talk about the statistics on the untapped power of women, and they're real, right? So we hear that you could feed 150 million more people if you if women had equal access to inputs in agriculture. And you see that growth rates could be increased if women were a higher percentage of business owners, because they're very, very vastly marginalized as owners and operators of businesses. But what we need to realize is there's incredible time poverty. I don't think anybody in this room would say those women who aren't producing as much or who aren't part of the workforce are doing nothing. And one study in Benin found that when you looked at men and women, women were putting 17 hours more labor into their work week because they were part of the economy, and they were also doing a disproportionate share of the work at home. So I think the issue, there are two routes to trying to tackle this. One is how you shift this balance between men and women. And that can involve strategies like laws and regulations and rules and policies, or it can involve cultural shifts. The other can be decreasing the burden on women or decreasing the burden on families generally. And I would posit that there are 4 avenues for moving this forward. The first, and we've talked some about it, is the flexibility in the workplace. So I mentioned issues related to telework. Obviously, those are going to apply only in some places, but you can have alternative work schedules. You can have the flexi time that people have talked about. You can create staff care facilities. And we've talked about the shifts to parental leave, and how you configure that has an impact on whether you're trying to decrease the burden on women or whether you're trying to shift the burden from men to women. So that's one category, is that issues of flexibility. The second is the making decisions in the way you make investments that are cognizant of how you want to redistribute work. What do I mean? You referred to the issues of investment in water or in fuel wood collection and infrastructure. If we say when we're making infrastructure investments, I want to invest in ways that will enable women to be part of the productive economy, then you're shifting in terms of the kinds of investments you're making quite dramatically. Because it may not be roads you want to build. It may be many, many, many water pumps that decrease the time that women need to walk to collect water. So those kinds of decisions are really going to be essential. The third is around childcare, and somebody mentioned the issue of childcare in the workplace. We've created, to your point, Rangita, payment for women to take children to peace processes, so that we're trying to take away the added cost and burden, the barrier that women face in getting to the peace table, by buying down that cost, because we recognize that peace processes are usually held in a third location, and that many women will opt out if you say, well, you can go, but your kids have to stay behind. So those issues of childcare exist and are morphed in many areas. And then the fourth is, I think it's the issues of shifting norms and cultural attributes, and it gets to the issues you were raising, Prime Minister Bruton, about, for example, cooking and who does what work. And in South Africa, it was very interesting. The women in Parliament banned nighttime meetings, because what they found was, even though they were getting into Parliament, they weren't included in decision-making conversations because the meetings were held at night, and they had to go take care of their kids and cook dinner. So those kinds of changes are what create space. And hopefully, if we're thinking very intentionally about these things upstream, we can move to take advantage of the power of women by planning in a way that enables that to take place without just increasing burdens.
Thank you, Carla. Those are very insightful points. You first raised the issue of the importance of childcare, and you spoke about Bangladesh as a very powerful example. In Norway, 79% of women with children under the age of 6 are able to work because of quality childcare being legislated. And I again emphasize quality childcare, because that is what makes both men and women comfortable about the caregiving that they are afforded to. The second, you spoke about the importance of culture, changes in culture. And laws and policies are important not in and of themselves, but because they also have both normative and constitutive power to change roles. But the need to change culture is very well taken, especially in the context of women's leadership, because that's how culture then gets shaped and informed. Kim Campbell, the former Prime Minister of Canada, writes in Different Rulers, Different Rules, what the presence of women also does, whether it is in parliament or on the bench, is to make it possible for men to be more of the things that they want to be. And I think that's very important. As women become elected to the House of Commons, the House did away with night sittings. And men came and thanked me for that cultural shift. So I think your point on that is very well taken. You also spoke about the need to engage more boys in traditional caregiving activities that were considered historically female. And Vietnam, in its gender equality law, has a provision, which is obviously difficult to implement or operationalize, is that boys should be trained in household work. And I think that's a very important suggestion which can be educative, although it might be difficult to really monitor. Your point about providing money for women peacemakers to come to the peacemaking table is very well taken, but I think it's important to again wear the gender lens and make sure that men, male peacemakers who want to come to the table bringing their children, whom they are obliged to take care of, be given the same financial incentives to do so. And again, I say this, in Vietnam, the gender equality law provides for women who work outside of their home in a rural area, if they have children below the age of 3, to take them with them and have the state pay for childcare services. Now, the fatal flaw in that is that the same provision is not allowed for men who choose to take their children with them when they work outside of their home. And now our final speaker is Cecilia López Montaño, Senator. You served in leadership positions at ILO. You were the ambassador of Colombia to the Netherlands. And as senator, one of your principal legislative initiatives was the creation of the Commission for Women's Equality and the law of 1430 of 2010. And you have mainstreamed equal caregiving and work-family reconciliation laws into your law. But as you know, in our very, very rich conversations, we've been talking of laws and policies, but we are yet to talk about the ways in which those laws and policies can be monitored. And that is why the commission that you helped to set up would come into play. So can you speak generally about this issue, but also speak specifically about how these laws and policies can be enforced and the role of human rights commissions, women's rights commissions, legal commissions for women's equality play in making real these policies and laws?
Thank you. Well, I will put this issue in a more macro way, if you allow me. I think we are facing, as a world, a dilemma. And I would like to use the words of Maria Floro, one of the feminist economists that are very well recognized. And Maria says something that I think describes perfectly what we're living. We're living in a dilemma because we have a great pressure to have more economic growth in order to respond to increasing demand of the consumers for material goods. But at the same time, we are looking at the fact that many government and the society has not the ability to take care of the people and to take care of the ecosystem. So you can say we have a care crisis. Mm-hmm. Maybe we haven't talked about this here, but we are talking about care crisis all over. So, and this care crisis is not going to be solved. It's going to be worse because people are getting old, and in a very fast way, they're getting very old in our developing countries. Before I tell you my proposal that I have been working with in my center, let me make a difference between care and care economy. Care, that love that you give to your children, to your family, the time you spend taking care of yourselves, that's something nobody else can do for you. But there is another type of activities that have to do with care. And those activities are not paid, are not visible, and are taking care of the family, taking care of the house, and are done all over the world, mainly by women. And those activities can be done by a third person. That is care economy. Care economy is those activities of care, not paid, not visible, that can be assumed by a third person. Okay. Making that clear, what is my proposal, what I have been working on? in order to solve this crisis from a macro perspective, my proposal is that you transfer care economy, not care economy from the invisible role it has to mainstream economics. How do you do that? First, and I can say I launched the first law in Latin America about this, and the law only does half of the way. How do you do this? First, and this is something that the law can have the mandate, as we did in Colombia, and now they have in Peru, and they will be doing it all over Latin America. The law tells the institution that has to deal with data to identify care economy through a time use survey. Then you have to value it. And they have valued it in Europe, and they have valued it all over the world. And then you put it in a pilot account, okay? And then you make it visible, and you know how much it costs. Okay, up to that, you have the law that can do that. But that's not enough. What do you have to do? You have to transfer that economy among, you have to put more responsibilities, take them away from this bunch of women and few men, and put some on the state, on the market, and the private sector, and on men. How? Through public policies. That's the big problem, because then you need a political will that is very difficult to have. What do you do with the laws, with the public policies? You tell the state, okay, you take seriously the responsibility of taking care of children, of taking care of the elderly, of taking care of sick people, yeah? And people that have limitations. But also, when you do that, what do you do immediately? What is the workload? And you mentioned that. The workload, if you add care work plus the work in the labor force, is much more bigger on women than on men, all over the world. Okay, then when the state assumes this responsibility, then you reduces the time women dedicate to this type of things, and you do something. Women will be allowed to make a decision that men always can do. Men always can say, okay, I want to work. I want to go to the labor market, or I want to stay home. Usually they don't stay home taking care of kids, but that can change. But women doesn't have the chance, especially poor women. Poor women are overloaded with care duties, and they cannot move to the labor market. But then, at the same time, as public policies, you can stimulate the private sector to create something that we could call, we were discussing this with the World Bank, care industries. What are those care industries? Those care industries are many of the ones you have in the States, for example, frozen food, even things to clean the, how do you call that?
Cleaning product.
The things that make robots to clean the house. All these things now are available for in certain countries for rich people. Well, you can make them available for everyone. What do you do then? Again, you free women, and then they can decide if they go to the labor market, and at the same time you can improve the quality of care. But at the same time, if care is visible and is recognized as part of the economy, men can do it. Let me tell you, at the same time that you free women, the state of the government and the private sector are going to demand labor force to do those tasks. And I'm sure that if you pay a man a decent salary for changing diapers, they will do it. There is not an intrinsic reason why men cannot take care of babies, okay? So this, if you transfer this care economy to mainstream economics, you are generating more labor force, feminine labor force. We are going to reduce one of the big gender gaps we have all over the world is the labor participation rate. But at the same time, you are offering new jobs that would not have only for women. We have to be careful. We have to have men doing care labor. Okay, what would be the benefit? Mexico did the first, they measured, the first measure of care economy is done by Mexico without a law. We have to have a law. You know how much it's equivalent? To 21% of GDP. Twice as much as the contribution of agriculture, much more of the contribution to GDP than industry, okay? Then, suppose you cannot translate all the care economy to mainstream economics. Suppose you just translate 10%, because some people want to stay at home taking care of the family. 10% of more GDP means, you know, more economic growth. At the same time, you will have more women working. You will have more people paying taxes, yeah? And you will have something very important. You will have women with autonomy. this is very important. The only way you can really give women autonomy is economic autonomy, and that is not given by income transfers. That's my big fight with the World Bank, with the IDB. I don't believe in income transfers because they limit the woman, the possibilities of women to go to the market, and they just have to reinforce their traditional values. You are killing the possibility of having women being more autonomous with that policy. Maybe you are helping them, but they don't want to work. They want just to make the queue to get the subsidy. And you can imagine the damage you are doing with that policy. Okay, at the same time, maybe the most important thing is that we have empowered women in education and health, and those gaps, gender gaps, are almost closed, as many indicators show. But what happened? You're more educated, women are more educated than men, they live longer, they have smaller families, they have more healthy years to live, and they go to the labor market and they squeeze them. So if you allow them to discharge the responsibilities from here and move to the labor market, then you will benefit from all the investment all the world has done for years on women's education and on women's health. So this is a new economic model. This is the beginning of building up a new economic model. So I think this macro way of looking at it will really help to change not only the perspective but the model.
No,
thank you.
Thank you, Senator. You've really imagined a new global order. And I think that's very important. And I'm so glad you brought up the whole example of Mexico. And Mexico also has a social security and pension system for women caregivers, which is really important and speaks to your point. But your point also brought up the whole issue that we are yet to touch on when women who are privileged enter the market economy, you create a whole subaltern world of women caregivers who are hired by these women. Yes, and when men and women enter the market economy, there's a whole subaltern world, especially in the global south, of female paid or underpaid caregivers. And they work in an unregulated or under-regulated labor market, under-regulated labor law system. So I think it's very important to also look at their role in caregiving and the ways in which that their role is not in any way quantified, and is not, that the market economy does not really value that caregiving work. So this was a very rich, very provocative discussion, and I know all of you are bursting with questions. And I want you to be as provocative as our speakers and to challenge them with your ideas, to push the boundaries of change. Yes. Yes. Yes, sir. Will you introduce yourself?
Yes, Diego Hidalgo. I am a co-founder of the Club of Madrid from civil society. At the time that I co-founded with the Gorbachev Foundation of North America, the Club of Madrid, we had some family affluence that allowed us to be philanthropic. And I'm going to talk, I mean, you have talked mostly about government policies and about business. But there is another side, I think, which is civil society. What can do civil society to economically empower women? I got together with 3 of my 4 other daughters, and we created a foundation called DIMES, which is whose mission is to empower women in developing countries. Now, what we found, we have 4 projects. One in Bolivia, one in Kyrgyzstan, we had one in Ghana, which was very successful and it was wound up, and one in the Sahrawi camps. Now, when you go to very poor developing countries, you don't find the situation that you have discussed so far. For instance, you have assuming biparental homes, and you have lots of monoparental homes. And we found that we could empower women by indeed encouraging the creation of daycare facilities for children. We could empower women by microcredit, which is what we did in Ghana. It was very successful. But in Bolivia and in Kyrgyzstan, we found that the main problem was mistreatment or gender violence. And that there were many women who had to flee and escape and hide from men who were beating them up and mistreating them. So then we created two foundations. We had trouble because the men were very aggressive towards us, particularly in Bolivia. But it was the goal was to empower women by first sheltering them when they were victims of gender violence, and then finding jobs for them.
So do you have a question, or
yes,
is
the
it?
question is,
Yes.
what can civil society do best to empower economically women?
Who would like to? Yes, Senator.
No, I'm worried about empowering women, because we have been empowering women for years and years. And now women are more educated, live longer, have smaller families. Even in the monoparental, if you, they are more educated than the average in many of the rural sectors of Latin America, for example. But then what happens? If you don't change something about care, if you allow them to keep on with the society thinking, even the development cooperation thinking that care is women's responsibility, that woman will get to the labor market and they won't be able to do anything. So what do you gain by empowering women if you do not change the rules of the society in order that they can have autonomy, economic autonomy? So I think that instead of looking at empowering women, we should go and see the gender gaps. Where are the gender gaps now? They are not in education, they are not in health, they are in access to power. It's huge. It's huge, the gender gap in power, and in access to the labor market. So let's work on that. If we keep on educating women and doing things like that, if you don't change some structural things in the society that will move this paternalistic way of a patriarchal way, you're not going to do anything. You keep on investing in education and they will be frustrated because they won't have a decent salary. Let me tell you, a woman that has economic autonomy won't allow anybody to be violent. Leave the man that is doing things to me if I can support my children. The violence has a lot to do with the fact that women do not have the same economic opportunity.
No, that's right. And closing the gender gap in caregiving also goes a long way in addressing patriarchy in the family, because it again engages men as caregivers and not in and dissolves that power structure that is so prevalent in families where violence occurs. You had a question, and then you.
Rangita,
Yeah.
I just want to
Carla,
add two
please
quick
do.
things. I think there are two essential roles for civil society. I mean, there are many, but one is in filling gaps where there aren't services provided that are essential. Shelters for battered women and treatment are often not provided by countries around the world, and civil society fills that gap. Doing things like small infrastructure that's been overlooked often by big development banks and large infrastructure projects. I think the other role that civil society can play is in modeling behavior. There's a lot greater flexibility in the private sector and within civil society to try and test out different approaches to creating a family-friendly work environment. And having moved from civil society into government, there are a lot of things I had that I now don't have. As a result of moving into a more structured environment, and we're trying to follow civil society's lead in government. So I think those are two.
If you move the care into the monetary economy, you will dramatically increase the gross domestic product, because services that were previously not counted in financial terms will start to count, and that would increase your apparent GDP. But one has to ask the question, will it improve the care? Is there any evidence that care given by one's own parent to a child is better than somebody giving that care who knows that they may never see the child again after a year or two because they'll move on to another job? Do children need some constancy in the care that they get? I'm surprised that the discussion has not focused so far at all on the needs of children. You, in your many interventions, have constantly been referring to women and their needs, and that's fair, but at the end of the day, it's children who will be here longer than either women or men, because the women and the men will die. and the children will still be alive. And we need to consider, I think, what is the impact that that substituting for parental care, professionalized care will have on children, on their own sense of themselves, of their own self-worth, on their own ability to develop long-term relationships with other people. If the people who have most intimate contact with them in their early life are carers who will be rotated out every year or two, rather than a parent, man or woman, will that affect in any way, I don't know the answer to this question, will that affect in any way that child's ability 40 or 50 years from now to maintain a stable relationship with another person? I think that's one thing. I also raised a number of points in my intervention about the fact that there is substantial evidence that boys are falling behind. There are more of them in jail, more of them being killed in road accidents, more of them unemployed. And I think we've got to ask that question too. Why is that? I think we have to look at that too. Perhaps the next conference should be about men.
And the absence of men in childcare, because I think that.
Oh, absolutely, I agree. I mean, men are gender stereotyped too.
That's
the
right.
expectations of what the life that they should live is sort of preordained for them,
Right.
and that's not advantageous necessarily to them. But I think we've also got to recognise that men and women. Now, is there some irreducible difference between men and women? Are men and women exactly the same? Mary Robinson said yesterday that women were better in terms of being concerned, more practical. She said that women were better at looking after their grandchildren. Is that a permanent feature, or is that simply a consequence of culture? If it's a permanent feature, then we have to take account of it. Perhaps there should be some gender differentiation if there is something inherent in a difference. But we haven't asked that question.
No, you're right, but I think we started on the premise that both parents have common responsibilities for the upbringing and development of their children, as enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So I'm glad you bring the rights of the child to the center of this to this discussion. Although, as someone pointed out, this is not only about childcare, but also about elder care.
No, I just wanted a small point, because
Yes.
I think people should. First, that's why I made a distinction between care and care economy. I mean, the love you have to give to your children, I mean, nobody can make that for you. But I'm talking about poor women.
You can't do that if you're not there.
Pardon me?
You can't show your children love if you're not there. If you're
but
gone
let me-
at 7 in the morning
Okay.
and don't get back till late at 9
Okay,
o'clock
but let
at
me
night.
tell you this. You're talking about women. What I want is women to have the liberty, to freedom to choose. But what about poor women? If you see in Latin America, poor women, they lock the kids in the house because they have to earn a salary. What is better? To have the poor kid the whole day alone in the house. Sometimes there is a fire and they are killed, or to have them in a organized care center. We are not obliging any woman to do whatever. No, what I'm trying to say is that if you, as a government and a society, as a private community, etc., decides to take some care activities, you are going to allow the woman to decide, to be free to decide. I am a professional, but I want to take care of my kids. I don't want to send them to anywhere. Okay, I'll stay. But what about the woman that has to go to the labor market and doesn't have anybody to help? So I think you have to think about poor women.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask a
Sure,
question
Carla.
on your initial thesis. Do you think that a shift in child care responsibilities to have a greater role for men would help with the issues you raised related to boys?
I think it would. I think that boys need to have to develop more of their caring side and be given the encouraged to do that, and that sexual stereotyping should be minimised or avoided. However, we don't know
Yeah, you're right.
whether there are irreducible differences that will always remain, and that there are on average, certain aptitudes that women have better than men, and certain aptitudes that men have better than women. We don't know, and we probably never will, but we must be, I think, cautious in applying legislation which is rigid and which tries to put everybody into the same category. There are some men who may be better carers than their wives, would be, but also the average may be the opposite of that. And I think we've got not to sort of, and that's why I worry about monetizing things. You know, that we should value things that are not paid for too.
Just one thing on the care economy, just because there have been many experiments and domestic work is a whole area, especially vis-a-vis, for example, the Arab world and Asia, where we have outsourced huge amounts of daily work, and it's resulted in an infringement on another set of women who come under very horrible circumstances on the whole without regulation. So, yes. I mean, I think we have a sense of the elements, because basically you have surplus labor economies in the East, and you have richer countries and economies that are willing to grow and want to grow faster than their own population can support. In a perfect world, this is a good match. In actual fact, and for the first time now, we have a convention on domestic work to regulate, to try and regulate some of that. We've created a new market, but the insistence is even poorer households need to have this right, which means they can't pay, and you get into terrible, terrible violations of working conditions and rights. So, you know, there are some experiments very, very far advanced, and I think the issue is to keep the vigilance on. And we found that those physical presence is not the same as quality of care. Right. I mean, you can be with a child for 16 hours and it doesn't translate into a whole lot of nurturing, but that's maybe a different story. But
the whole idea of the absence of male caregivers in a boy's life and the correlation of that to maybe juvenile delinquency is interesting, and there is data to show that boys, violence is learned behavior. You learn violence from male caregivers, and therefore, you know, having a male in one's life is just not enough. It is the kind of quality of caregiving that we are talking about. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to take 3 questions. Oh, sorry, sir.
Just a word. I agree upon the idea that it could be useful to have a discussion about men.
Yes.
Because, in fact, the stereotypes, they are mainly about women. And we don't discuss about the stereotypes of men. Because men are not considered, even in the religion, as a stereotype, but as a prototype, if I may say so. Which means the man is the reference, and the woman is different from the man, and we never raise the question how the men are different from the women. It could be interesting to think why there is much more, why the criminality is mainly the fact of men. Why in the prisons there are mainly, even if there are female prison, of course, but the majority of the crime are coming from the men. The violence is coming from the men. Yesterday, perhaps in the same room, we discussed about the rape as a weapon in civil wars. Well, you heard of female rapes, but not of massive rape of men by female. You know, perhaps old young boys by older men. But so this discussion about the men stereotype and how it could change his own idea of himself, this self-imaginaire, you know, could be also interesting.
So changing gender role stereotypes is definitely a recommendation that we are going to take forward. In the interest of time, I'm going to take questions. Please make it brief, and then I will ask our distinguished panel to intervene. I think you... yes, very briefly introduce yourself and your question, and then the 2 of you at the back. Yes.
Hi, I'm Lenise Collins with the United Nations, and Mrs. al-Nashif sort of touched on the question that I have, which is about migration and the feminization of migration. As you have women increasingly going abroad to work as caregivers, especially in countries with aging populations, to work as domestic workers. And will that shift the debate at all for those countries, those places back home, where they now have to figure out who will care for these children that these women leave behind, sometimes for years at a time while they go out and seek work, because we do know that they contribute a lot to the GDP via remittances. So will this migration, the feminization of migration, change the debate at all? And is this an opening for government and civil society to then step in and use that as an opportunity to look at caregiving and family structures?
Wonderful. So you'll take that question, but we'll have 2 more questions.
My name is Andy Morrison from Inter-American Development Bank. And I have a question about the provision of caring services. One of the revolutions in Latin America has been the community provision of caring services. In Colombia, hogares comunitarios, or community households. In Peru, Wawawasi, where poor women in neighborhoods are trained as caregivers. I see Cecilia shaking her head, so she has very strong opinions about this. This can be viewed as empowering women and giving them a wage. It can also be viewed as providing poor quality child care and reinforcing gender stereotypes in care provision. So I'd like the panel's take on community provision of caring services in the developing world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you?
My name is Farida Alagi. I'm from the Libyan Forum of Civil Society. Just a very quick remark. Since '75, this debate was on the table of all women conferences at the UN. And it kept being repeated and repeated over and over and over. And the time has come, to be very honest with you, to stop and say what went wrong, why it didn't happen. Lots of recommendations, laws, policies, research, procedures, all have been there. Many, millions of recommendations. So I think the time has come that new paradigms, a paradigm shift that must happen now. Because I don't think the time for us in the Arab world today, with the Arab Revolution, where are we heading? To hell, maybe. So now, neither the policies, nor the funders, nor the millions that have been spent. In my opinion, it's becoming a fatigue, boring. The United Nations have to have its revolution. It cannot continue the way business has been conducted, because I am witnessing, not only to the UN, to the EU, to the international donor, I think the time has come that we need also to question these millions of money, where did they go? They went to small groups of whatever, English-speaking language women, professional, high class, city. Then, secondly, also, in my opinion now, for us in the region, the discourse is, are we, it is not only a matter of women, yes women, we are all victimized, it's a matter of nations and future society that we are losing. Therefore, I like very much what the 2 gentlemen have said. And also, we cannot put women in one basket. Be careful. Be careful. Who are these women that we are talking about? The rich, the educated, the city, the poor, the illiterate, the divorced. Now in the Arab world, we have a high rate of divorce. 30 to 40% of divorces happening among the younger generation. 25 to 35 of women are heading households. So, all the Arab Revolution, Egypt, 100 years ago, the women's movement started. Today, God knows where we are going in no time. So, the time has come. Yes, we need to be honest with you. To first of all, for us as women, to look in the mirror and say, what went wrong with us? First, what went wrong with the women's movement internationally from all levels? Secondly, we need also now to bring men, yes, a conference for men, for heaven's sake. Why there is this mental block? It is not easy. We cannot just put policies, laws, rules, debates, discussion. It's not happening. It's not. It's very, very behavioral, attitudinal, psychological, religious, political, economic. It's a package. And private sector, for heaven's sake, don't tell me about private sector. Private sector are the greediest, the dirtiest, the most corrupt, at least the way I view them in our part of the world.
Thank you. No, this is very passionate. Yes.
My question. She knows that I'm always, I know them inside out. The World Bank, what is it that you think now You want to rethink, to re-evaluate. I think the human brain is no longer able to handle complex problems. There are softwares now that put all this mess and helps us. Because we are failing to think out of the box, to think differently. And in my opinion, I honestly believe, strongly believe, go and start with children. In Saudi Arabia, we have been taking children to cook, and the young girls to want to be astronauts. Miracle happens. I'm a strong believer in that. And I hope the international donor community for the next 20 years believe me.
Thank you.
You need to be visionary. Put your money in small children. Don't lose your money with 50, 60,
Yes,
70 years.
thank you. We enjoyed your comments. They were so passionate, but now I'm going to ask interlocutors to respond.
Well, the first thing that I want to say is that I agree that we have to change the paradigm. We have listened to a lot of men here saying that we have to have a new discourse, a new way of looking at it. And it has to start with the fact of forgetting about sexual division of labor. Women are the caretakers and men are the ones that are going to work. You have to change that. Women have to be seen as agents of development. Going back to the fact, look what happened with hogares comunitarios, you know. Just you reproduce poverty and they don't pay women because that's not work. They gave them a scholarship, half of minimum salary. I mean, what? I mean, that doesn't help. That is work. That is very important. You're taking care of kids. Care has to be, again, in the development agenda as something that is the responsibility of civil society, of communities, of families, of governments, and private sector.
Can you very quickly respond, since you and I discussed that, the issue of migrant workers?
Migrant workers, yeah. Just to say, of course, yes, I mean, we're talking about lower skilled migration in general. Of course, I'm not talking about the regulated formal economy. But of course it's shifting that debate. First of all, because normally it's women in domestic work, and this is particularly in the Arab world, it's from North Africa to Europe, but really the majority is between Asia and the Arab states for us, and men as construction workers, but also as gardeners, as cooks, so there is some sort of care on the side. It's shifting the debate because of the proportions that are involved. In remittances, if you look at somewhere like the Philippines, which is heavily dependent on remittances, but also because of the failures of job creation at home, which are presenting a very huge dilemma because no substitution is possible for many of these. So to overcome really a new set of problems in the countries of origin and the countries of destination, the dynamic is now how sustainable are these flows and what are the new problems that they're creating, which is new kinds of dependencies at home because these women are leaving their children with their grandparents and their neighbors and their sisters and so on, and you're creating a new network of interdependence which is not necessarily going all the way to solve social problems, even though the poverty issue is a little bit alleviated by it, but also the kinds of violations of rights that occur in the process, and on the margins it's trafficking, it's not just a movement of unregulated labor, but also because of the weak regulatory systems in the countries that are receiving these women. So yes, it's a shifting dynamic, and I think we have to deal with a new set of rules for it.
Thank you. Carla, very quickly, do you want to respond to all three questions?
Sure.
Your closing remarks.
I think on the issue of feminization of migration, what we've not done is look at when the migration was heavily male and what the impact was of that. I mean, to the debate that we've been having overall. And I think it's the differentiated change that's taking place and how that has an impact. But I think this is the idea that people go out and migrate for work is not new. And so we haven't looked at that. And it gets to this issue of how do you set your baseline? Is your baseline that men go and do these things and you're not questioning it? I think the issues related to communities of care, I mean, that's an issue we've had even in the United States. You know, the quality of the daycare to which kids attend is a big debate. And I think that, you know, at the end of the day, obviously, it's all about how things are implemented. And they can be great or they can be terrible. And how you create systems that succeed is important. I tend to be a little bit more optimistic than you do, because what I think is that actually these changes are taking place in societies all around the world, and different societies are at different places, but the shifts in responsibilities are taking place. I think that the disconnect is actually the ability of formal structures to keep up and adapt. And what struck me when you were talking, although I will, you know, it's an American population and it's elite, was two things. We had there was an article that came out, for those who are in the United States, in the Atlantic, in the Atlantic Monthly about balancing work and family. And very famous, written by Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was the head of policy planning at our State Department. It's worth reading, but the biggest reaction to that article, which talked about women can't, it was called Women Can't Have It All, or something like that, were the men who said, don't tell me this is a problem for women. This is a problem for today's families. And these were the men who were really angry at the conjecture that the work world today is about women taking care of families and men don't face those burdens. So I think the problem is we're not getting structures caught up, laws, policies, procedures that enable us to deal with the generation of workers that is growing up today and is trying to make that balancing act. And I think that that's a real problem.
I'm going to ask the two prime ministers to very quickly respond and your closing remarks, because we are now we're at the point when we're closing. So I'd like you to respond to the comments, as well as Carla's comment that at the center of this issue is the fact that we still don't that law and policies lag behind the reality. The reality is that those gender roles are changing, have not changed yet, but is changing slowly, but the law is yet to reflect those changes. Yes.
Well, compared to the three women and perhaps also the Prime Minister, I'm not sure I'm in a position to answer really, but perhaps I can raise another problematic, another avenue. I want to answer to our very eloquent Libyan woman. Yes. Well, I'm not sure that we can only decide to lay upon, to trust the children, you know, to forget with the parents and to say, okay, they are old-minded and we can't change them, so we have to look at the children. But the children are educated by the parents. And the capacity of the children to repeat the stereotypes in racist terms or in anti-feminist terms is obvious. So I don't think that to make this jump would be the solution. We have to take the reality as it is and generation as they are. The point I wanted just to raise, even if I know that it can be dealt with in another commission, but I have no ubiquity gift. The senator told us, well, try to transfer the care, economic care, in economic care and in the public sector. À l'inverse, on the reverse? No?
On the private sector.
No, but on the contrary, I want to raise another question. Be careful not let the work, the fact to consider something as a work, and the market invade private spheres, especially about women. There is a debate in Europe about do we have to regulate, to rule prostitution or not? I'm against that, you know. If the fact to give her body to several men to accept what they want because they pay is considered as a work, as it is the case in Germany, for instance, or in Holland, which is not the case now in France. I think it's a it's a regression, you know. And I should say the same thing about what is called in America, accepted in some states, refused in others, surrogate mothers. The fact to consider that the body of a woman is un outil de production, and that a child is a merchandise, is a good, I think it's a human, very grave regression. So I wanted only to raise this point.
Thank you. And Prime Minister?
I think I must say I think what has happened in the last 100 to 200 years has been that things that are paid for in cash have tended to become valued more and celebrated in the media. People who do well financially, that's celebrated. Whereas things that can't be measured in cash tended to be devalued. Mm-hmm. And we see a tendency here to move care for people more into the cash economy and away from something that's given out of love. And I'm not so sure that that's a particularly good development. I think we need to return to a true sense of the value of a life as measured other than by money. And I feel that that we value each human being for themselves, just as a person, not as a merely economic unit. And I find, I must say, that capitalism narrows the discussion, feminism narrows the discussion, and we need to have a broader discussion that looks at the total human person and whether they're living a fulfilling life.
Yes.
And I think we need to start really with children, because they will be around longer. And we must, rather than discuss this subject in terms of what are the rights of women or the rights of men, which I think is a rather arid and narrowing approach, we should look at what is good for children. How will the people who will be around 90 years from now, when we're mostly dead, how will they have been affected by the decisions that we're making now? And we just don't know, but I think we must allow ourselves to admit we don't know, rather than try to beat one another over the head with statistics, which a lot of these debates tend to be about. And looking for some sort of strict equality, when in fact we're all different. Yes. Whether we be in terms of age or gender or whatever, we're all different. Yes. And we need a society that's subtle enough to take all that into account and not unduly prescriptive. That is a learning, that we're learning all the time, rather than laying down rules for other people that we admit we don't know and that we're learning and groping.
Yes. Thank you. The two Prime Ministers have concerns about the commodification of care, but you both agree that gender must be seen through more dynamic lenses rather than in these cartoonish cardboard ways. So in order to sum up our very rich discussion, I want to leave you with two very quick quotes which amplify the voices of all of our discussion leaders. Crystal Eastman in 1990 stated at the first feminist congress in the US, "What is the problem of women's freedom? It seems to be this: how to arrange the world so that women can be human beings with a chance to exercise their infinitely varied gifts instead of being destined by the accident of their sex to be just reduced to one activity, housework and child raising." And more recently, Kim Campbell's quote, which I want to re-echo: "What is the presence of women? What does women's presence do, whether in parliament or on the bench? It is to make possible for men to be more of the things that they want to be." So finally, this discussion is about for both men and women and for our children to be more than what we can be. Thank you.